Greetings, fanboys and fangirls. Jared here, and I'm welcoming you back to our special 4-part video series about the original Justice League merchandising push, particularly when it comes to action figures. In this 4-part series, we will be covering 4 different areas. The first part, which if you haven't watched it yet, please watch it at the link below. It's all about the basic toy line that Mattel did that was more aimed for kids, but this video will focus on the original 6-inch Multiverse adult collector push that Mattel had out in 2017. Something else that we'll be focused on in future episodes will be in the next part. We'll be discussing the Lego push, and then we'll be discussing the premium adult collectible market. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Now, for those returning from the last video, it is very important to establish the difference between these two lines. We will do that by using Superman. So on the left here, we have our Superman that was from the DC Multiverse 6-inch collectible line. And then on the right, we have the line that we discussed the previous video, which is just the Mattel Basic Series 6-inch line. You can tell right away that there is a slight difference in scale, but not as much of one as you would think for two lines that were running on the shelf concurrently. You could literally find these side by side at places like Walmart and yes, Toys R Us at the time. As a matter of fact, this is one of the last big merchandising pushes I remember at Toys R Us. You can see that scale-wise, they are almost compatible with each other. It's a very slight difference, and I would say it amounts to no more, if even all of, half of an inch between them. The basic line Superman is a little bit more brightly colored, a little bit more vivid, which is actually probably more film accurate to the theatrical cut of Justice League. And on the left, you can see that that Superman is certainly a little more dully colored, quite a bit of different sculpting. Now, something that I was never able to wrap my head around are how the two head sculpts end up sort of looking similar or from a very similar digital source, yet they are definitely not. There's things about them that are definitely different and definitely distinct, but I don't know if this is a case of the same person doing the same like digital source that these are based on, or if they really are from the same digital source, but one factory did this and upped it to this scale, and one factory did this. But the other big difference is the articulation. The basic scale introduced things like hinges on the shoulders, and it still had, though, the basic T-crouch articulation that we saw from a lot of basic toy lines. Nothing at the ankles, and then just a knee. But with the Multiverse line, it had more of the standardized articulation that you expect from a collector's line, and this is pretty well across the board for all these figures. So you can have a head that actually can go a little up and down, but not dramatically. It can go left to right. You do get shoulder hinge, just like that basic line. Then you also get an up and down movement. You get a bicep swivel, a single jointed elbow, which it's a shame it wasn't double since this was supposed to be the collector's line. And you just have a rotation at the wrist. That's right, and here's where things get a little funny. There is wrist hinges on these guys, the basics, but no wrist hinges on the DC Multiverse. So I remember being incredibly confused at the time about that. Also, for some of these, you do have some kind of ab crunch, but for some of them, you don't. It's very strange. Here, we just have the basic Superman torso, which is a repurposing of a previous Superman torso. And then we just have an up and down movement at the legs, but much like the basic Flash in the last video, this is how far I can get Superman's leg up. So it's really kind of shocking. I mean, compare that with the basic series, where Superman's leg can go this far, almost 90 degrees. So it's really... So you can actually see the problem here already. You have figures that were supposed to be engineered for younger collectors, and then you have figures supposed to be engineered for adult collectors already falling behind in articulation. We also have just a single jointed knee, which does just as well as the other. We do get a thigh cut right here, or a knee cut, whichever one is closer to. You also actually do get a hinge at the ankles, but this was during the Dark Ages when Mattel refused to upgrade their ankle articulation, and it's literally just up and down. But here, I suppose, is the other big divergent point of articulation, and that's that you could actually do the splits with these guys. So that would allow them to hold some pretty wide poses, but keep in mind that because these are just hinges, you're not going to be able to pivot into being flat-footed in very wide stances. So it really limited your options. So you can probably already see how some of the problems are beginning to form already in this video, as we just did a comparison with a basic kids line that in some ways did have better articulation than the collector focus line. And with Superman himself, we'd better address the kryptonite in the room here, and that is the non-likeness that Superman features. Just put simply, it doesn't really look like Henry Cavill. It is sort of like Henry Cavill, I think, from some perspectives, some angles, but mostly it just isn't. And I would be kidding myself to say that it was. This is as cartoony a likeness as you can imagine, and it's very confusing because it's not even as good as their previous Henry Cavill likenesses that Mattel had done in previous waves. Say, for instance, the Man of Steel Superman, even though it too featured kind of an iffy Henry Cavill likeness, it looked a little bit more like him and certainly more realistic than this did. And we covered those figures here on the channel, oh, I don't know, a million years ago. But then you actually have this from Batman v Superman, that head sculpt, which had been just a couple of years before this. And you can see that this was more of a match for Cavill. Neither one of these are great, but this was at least a little more. This is the Toys R Us exclusive version, by the way, from Batman v Superman. But what is funny is that they just chose to basically reuse most of the figure. And you can see that it's quite obvious with this, that this is the same chest, it's the same S-shield, everything that we had gotten. And what's funny is that this is mostly a reworking of the Man of Steel Superman figure. So at this point, you're dealing with a figure that is mostly reused with articulation and tooling from 4 years or so before that. So it was already off to a bad start with Superman. One more thing I'll point out before we move on to the characters. They ditched the kind of plasticky, rubbery capes that they used to have, and they went with soft goods. Now, this is probably a pretty cool idea, and I know that at the time, people really clamored for soft goods, but I never was really one of those people. And then it just looks weird with this thing on the back. But I have no idea where the head sculpt came from, and I think they would have been better off just reusing their old head sculpt for as flawed as it was. The last funny note that I'll make is he kind of looks like Tyler Hoechlin, who is the guy who plays Superman in the CW shows and Superman and Lois. So if you're needing a Tyler Hoechlin Superman figure, maybe hunt this one down for a few bucks. Next up, we'll be taking a look at the Batman figures in line. We will start, just like in the film, with Batman's basic suit. Now, there were several store exclusives during this line, and this was one of them. This Batman was a Walmart exclusive. I remember being very happy to find him, but at the time, I certainly had my fanboy goggles on and didn't really see some of the shortcomings of the figure, possibly because I hadn't seen the film and didn't know exactly what Batman would look like in it with his basic suit. Certainly, it's not like this. The one thing I'll say is that the head sculpt is really good. I think that out of all of the Batman figures that we had gotten, this was probably the strongest head sculpt from them. And you know what? I honestly think that it still kind of holds up. I think you could probably put it beside of more premium figures, and it's not really a bad facsimile, especially for it to be a mass market figure. Just to give you a quick comparison, this is the Suicide Squad re-release of Batman in Mattel's 6-inch line. And you can just see that the new head is sharper, the eyes look better and less kind of, just dull. And I just think that everything about it just comes off a little bit better. But if the head's so great, then what's the shortcomings with the figure? Well, it's this horribly segmented body. And this is kind of a disaster. So earlier I harped about how Superman didn't have any kind of hinge here at the abs. No kind of ab crunch. But Batman has it, and I sure do wish that he didn't. Because you can only really tell from the side what I'm trying to say here. There's a giant well of negative space right there. And so it's this big overhang, as if Batman were the body of the T-800, like the Terminator endoskeleton. And it just looks awful, the way that it's joined. I've never seen less natural looking ab crunch articulation on a figure. And for some reason, it translates to the other joints of the figure as well. So you can see that there's all these weird kind of segmentations everywhere. And the elbow hardly works. This is as much articulation as you can get from the elbow. And it's really a shame because looking at the figure, there's actually plenty of good sculpting in the different segments of the body taken on their own. But when you put them together, almost like some kind of weird mannequin that's been put together wrong, then it becomes a huge problem. We have all the same articulation as Superman, except like I said, the elbows are somehow incredibly ineffective. And you just have the rotations of the wrists, like we said last time. It was not worth this giant gap right here. So this ended up being one of the more disappointing figures in the line for me. However, it is the way that you could get one of the 3 mother box pieces. So these 3 mother box pieces you could get by collecting different exclusives in the line, and these are actually really nicely sculpted. I can't remember exactly which one came with which, but I do know that one of them came with Batman here for this Walmart exclusive. They did this in lieu of Build-A-Figure pieces, and we will get into the Build-A-Figure in just a moment. Next up, we'll be focusing on Batman's tactical armor. You can see that there's plenty of great sculpted detail on the armor. Batman's wearing his non-removable goggles. I suppose that's the only little shortcoming of the figure. I wish it had come with an alternate head to simulate Batman having the goggles flipped up. And then everything else, though, is really nicely done. Clearly, they paid close attention to the source material and maybe had a digital source to go by for all of this. You also don't have the crazy gap in the torso articulation like the previous version had. But here it wouldn't be as noticeable anyway because of the armor. So Batman is clad in his parademon-resistant armor, and everything just looks really nice. Even the back is sculpted to simulate that, and this ends up being one of the better figures in the series. You can see that we can put the shoulders up, and he has plenty of articulation, and he does have that ab crunch. So he can do anything that the other figures can do. His elbow articulation, though, is horrible, maybe even worse than the Batman from the Walmart exclusive version. Other than that, everything is what you would expect. Just like Superman, he does use a soft goods cape, but I do feel like the Batman capes are actually really good in this line. You can see that they kind of have more of a vinyl feel, but they're not that super low quality vinyl that could get destroyed like from the Batman Power Attack figures and some of the other lines Mattel's doing at the time. On one side, it's vinyl, and on the other side, it's more fabric-y. And it actually looks good. It drapes fairly well. It's certainly not high-end or anything like that, but I've seen much, much worse. So one thing that I did with my tactical armor Batman is I actually switched the heads with the Walmart exclusive version so that I could get the version without the goggles. Now, that means there's no goggles setting on top of his head, but I always really liked this look and thought that that head sculpt was really strong. So I always thought this was a good pairing. Now, keep in mind, though, you'll have to heat the figure up in order to do this because they're very hard to get off of the ball peg. We will compare him to his basic line counterpart. This kind of seemed very generic. This certainly solves all those problems. And unlike Superman, it's very clear where the resources went in the multiverse line with this Batman. And he's actually really, really nice. So it's actually a very substantial upgrade. And this is exactly the kind of difference I would have expected to have seen in the Superman. Next up, we'll be discussing Wonder Woman here. Figure companies have struggled for quite some time to get Gal Gadot's likeness correct, and I really do think that this is one of the closest attempts that we've seen in the mass market. It really does look like her. It's actually fairly lifelike. I think my eye application is slightly off, with one eye maybe being a little higher than the other, but that's certainly more of a nitpicky kind of thing to say. But overall, I say it's fairly well done. You have the rest of the figure's body here, and I think that there are elements of this that are reused from the Batman v Superman figure of Wonder Woman. The head sculpt on that figure was actually quite bad, so it was really good to see them take another crack at it. This head sculpt was also utilized for their Wonder Woman multiverse line, which I never really bought into, but had a couple of pretty good figures in. I especially thought that their Steve Trevor with their Chris Pine likeness was actually very nice. And here she is compared to her basic figure. And you can see why this is such a substantial upgrade. Much better sculpting. The head sculpt is much nicer and much more like Gal Gadot. And I just think that overall it's a much better figure. So once again, this is the kind of difference that you would have expected. So overall, not bad at all for Wonder Woman. And in some ways, maybe has a little bit closer likeness than the recent McFarlane figure did. Next up, we'll be talking about Arthur Curry, the Aquaman here. And this is a very interesting one to discuss. You've got two different things going on with this figure, and they're in very, very different leagues. You've got the body, which I think is wonderfully done. There's an incredible amount of detail here, and it addresses all of my complaints that I had about the basic figure. If you remember, the basic figure had a very green body, and it wasn't exactly very film accurate. But this has the correct blend of gold and green to be film accurate. So I think it looks really great. Even on the back, we have all this wonderful wash work, and I think the paint is really nice. Everything's going great until bum bum bum, Aquaman's head shows up. And, it's not horrible. I can definitely tell who it's supposed to be. However, I would call this the Mad Magazine version of Jason Momoa. It's very, very, very gnarly. The beard is maybe a little long. The face is maybe a little slim, and it all leads to almost looking like one of those old oil paintings, a Blackbeard or a pirate of some sort. So it doesn't quite get the job done for me, even though I think it's not horrible. This is definitely middle of the road when it comes to the head sculpts. I can tell who it is, but I don't think that it's their best work by far. To the side, it actually looks quite a bit more like Momoa, but it doesn't quite do it when you bring it all the way around. It's funny because we wouldn't really get the definitive Momoa likeness from Mattel until they did the basic Aquaman line a little while later. And if you don't believe me, I will bring in one of the figures from the basic line, and the head sculpt is fantastic. I can tell exactly who it is. I don't know if their digital scan technology got a lot better or what, but this is from the basic line, not Multiverse line, of the Aquaman movie figures that Mattel would end up doing, and it is great. So I have to say they improved later on, but this is just too out there. He did come with a piece of Steppenwolf, which we'll get to at the end, and I think it's a pretty decent figure, but the articulation is one thing that is let down a little bit on this guy because, just like Superman, for some reason, there's no ab crunch on a figure that would really need it to get all the swimming poses that you would really want. The head can't do a whole lot because of the hair either. This is your middle-of-the-road figure. However, it is worth noting that after the recent announcement of the McFarlane figures, that I'm not really sure which one did Jason Momoa worse. So at least the designers at Mattel can kind of take comfort in that they weren't the only ones that struggled. Next up, we'll be looking at the Flash. I'm such a huge Flash fan. I actually think that this is a really good figure. The sculpting is very solid all throughout. You can see that every little detail from the film has been captured, unlike the basic version. This time, he does actually have paint applications to bring out all of those individual details, including the silver wires that apparently hold the suit together. So there's lots of good things going on here. The head sculpt is certainly much improved from that basic figure. The head sculpt is definitely pretty good, I think. I think that the only thing that kind of lets it down are some of the paint applications. Barry's eyes certainly appear to be a little anime-esque, I suppose, but they are well applied, so that's appreciated. If the eyes had been a tad smaller, I think it would have looked much more accurate to Ezra Miller. And the actual head itself has plenty of great details going on, although they did miss some paint applications on the back of the helmet and the sides. Other than that, though, it really does look quite nice, and I think they did a wonderful job with it. There was another way to own this figure, and it's something that I kind of wish that I had picked up, but I believe it was a Target exclusive, where you could get this in a 2-pack with one of the DC Multiverse figures from the comic version of Flash. I believe it was the new 52 version. And he actually came with an Ezra Miller Barry Allen head. Not sure if that thing's difficult to get now, but it's something that you never know. If I see it out at a show or something, I may grab it. This Flash actually does have double joints on his knees, so I really appreciate that Mattel actually was considerate enough to add double joints to the Flash, because he would really need them to get the kinds of running poses that we expect. The ankles are okay. It almost seems like they can rotate this time, but it's kind of iffy, and it seems a little stuck in there. But you can certainly get plenty of up and down movement, and I think because of that, you can get some pretty good running poses. Also, you actually do get the torso. It's not nearly as deep a cut as some of the other torsos in the line, but enough to where you could sort of rotate up and down if you needed. Everything else is the same articulation-wise, and the head probably has the best tilt of all of them. And just for the sake of comparison, here is Barry's basic figure with the Multiverse one, and you can see that it's not even a real comparison. So I'm really glad that this was a major step up. This is definitely one of the stronger figures in this line. Next up, we'll be having a look at Cyborg. I think that the sculpting itself on the body is really nice. Everything looks pretty good. Even the head sculpt is a fairly good match to Ray Fisher. It's certainly not as good a match as the McFarlane one that's coming out, but it really does look fairly nice. The shoulders seem kind of big, though, and I think that's the thing that lets down the proportions. It's not so bad when you put the arms up like this, but it kind of looks like two silver spheres that are just kind of mounted to the sides of a large chest. I'm not really sure what could have been done to remedy that. Perhaps the chest sculpt should have went out a little further, and these should have disappeared a little further into the body. I know it probably would have hindered some of the articulation had they done that, but it certainly would have caused that to not be so unsightly. Other than that, you do have some okay articulation, but no crunch because they don't want to disrupt the sculpting, which I understand. The legs actually function really well. He does come with an interesting accessory. It's the cannon he uses in both versions of the film. I believe it is the same. And it looks really nice. It's very well sculpted, and it has the kind of light blue vents. But they were also considerate enough to include alternate options. And you just end up with a peg right there. You take this, and you can have it to where he just has two hands. And there we have Cyborg with the two hands. And I think that he comes off pretty well. Like I said, if it wasn't for the huge shoulders, I think that he would probably be one of the very best. And just for comparison's sake, here is the basic Cyborg alongside the Multiverse counterpart. I certainly think that this is much nicer with much better sculpting, but the shoulders are more proportional here. And there are certain things about the head sculpt here that do remind me of Ray Fisher more than this one does. So overall, it's kind of a toss-up between these two, but if I had to go with one, I would say that this was the better version. It's not bad, and certainly I was very happy to get him at the time. He makes for a fairly fine stand-in the backgrounds of any of your displays. Cyborg actually received an alternate version, which was his armored-up version, and this was an exclusive. I believe that this Cyborg was a Walmart exclusive, just like the standard Batman was. You can see that there's quite a few differences. Even though the body is the same, the arms, including the shoulders here, have these giant pads on them, and the head is his armored version that is from the Snyder cut, which makes it even funnier that it was released in this standard action figure push. Like we said in the last video, when we looked at the basic version of him with a helmet down that was kind of in the funny paint scheme, it is funny how remnants of that original cut were peeking through even during 2017. Although it's kind of a funny comparison to make, I'll go ahead and put him right here beside of his basic counterpart. He also included one of the mother box pieces that we talked about earlier. And the last regular figure in this 6-inch line was Mira. You can see here that this was actually an Amazon exclusive. And it's funny because Mira's role is so decreased in the theatrical cut that it seemed kind of funny at the time that they even bothered to make a Mira. Well, looking at the Snyder cut now, I can obviously see why they wanted to do a Mira figure, because she actually has quite a bit of screen time. So I really like this one, and I think that the sculpting is nice, but the biggest thing here was quality control. And it's probably good that we have one that has some kind of quality control here, because it would not be very honest or representative of the line unless we did, because honestly, every time I went to buy one of these, there was always kind of a struggle to look through all the samples and make sure that they were good. But you can't really do that with the ones you order from Amazon. And so this one, one of her eyes is a little strange, and certainly a little misaligned there with a little too much white. So she ends up looking a little strange and a little, maybe like she's kind of had her mind altered slightly, if you get my gist, which might be accurate to the real Amber Heard, maybe. Oh, okay. All right, I won't go there again. Anyway, though, you can see that the costume itself is very nicely sculpted. All of the intricate detail that we got on the Aquaman figure, all of that is simulated here. So I really like that. She has a crown on that is really nice. And they did other Mira figures later on for the basic Aquaman line, but I don't think any of them really match how nicely done this one is. She also comes with some accessory hands, that is her manipulating water, which we didn't get to see her do too much in the actual theatrical version, but in the Snyder cut, we definitely see why they would have included something like this. And I like the translucence of that plastic, and it is permanently hooked onto that hand. Of course, she comes with standard hands and another water manipulating hand as well. I remember Amazon had a hard time getting rid of this, and I remember it going on clearance for very little. So if it's something that you're interested in, who knows, maybe it's still around really cheap. Now that all the mother boxes have been assembled, we know that there is one guy who will want them all, and that is Steppenwolf. I remember that from the outset of this line that I was fairly interested in getting everybody, but it probably wouldn't have been a sure thing unless they had offered this Steppenwolf Build-A-Figure. I was actually really impressed when they shown this thing off. The sculpting is very, very well done, particularly with the face and all the little craggly details of Steppenwolf's skin. I like all of the very intricate paint detailing as well, with the kind of brandishes of metallic blue, the red up here, and then the actual outfit has all sorts of cool things going on. Color-wise, it may not be the best representation of the actual theatrical film, but I do think that it's good enough. There's plenty of great details on the back as well. You can see that metallic blue and the black. And then for his axe that Steppenwolf carries, I actually think it's really well done. Very similar to the other versions we've had. However, the accessory is so large that it kind of warped down into this position, so it ends up kind of looking a little strange. For the articulation, we have kind of an up and down movement at the head here, and he has a pretty decent hinge. There is a really good ab crunch right there, and it looks all right when you flex it. Certainly better than Batman. There is a waist cut. The shoulders have hinges, which are hampered by the shoulder pads a little, but it's understandable. It can go up and down, but once again, shoulder pads get in the way. There is a rotation at the bicep. We do get a single joint hinge, but it's actually fairly effective. We do get a rotation at the wrist, but no hinges once again. They had something about against wrist hinges, I guess. The leg can go out okay, but the skirt kind of stops it. He does have a single joint that's really effective there at the knee. The boot doesn't swivel or anything that I can tell, but there is a thigh rotation on the inside. And we do have hinges at these ankles, which are kind of hard to work with, so they're a little stuck. Overall, though, I would say that this is a really good Build-A-Figure. Now, I know that people absolutely did not like Steppenwolf in the original theatrical version of the film, but I actually never really minded him that much. I actually thought that he was all right, and I always kind of liked what they did with the design of him, even though there were, of course, shots that weren't as convincing as others in the film. But I thought he was all right, and I really like the way that this turned out. I certainly won't apologize for it. Now, as a little comparison, this was the basic version of Steppenwolf, and you can see that there really isn't any kind of commonality between them whatsoever, which is really interesting. I remember at the time that a lot of people were saying, well, I'll just get this pack and kind of paint him up. He's not quite the same kind of beast as this guy is, so they're very, very different. And then just for fun, we do have the smaller Steppenwolf that was a part of the basic line. You can see that he is much smaller than either one of them. I hope that these guys have been able to work out a joint custody agreement, so best of luck to them. As for any other products that were released in the Multiverse line, there were two Toys R Us exclusives that had this moniker. There was the Parademon figure, which I thought was pretty nice, and I was always interested in grabbing it, but always had a hard time finding it around that time, so I'm not sure about the distribution there. The other figure that was abundantly available was shirtless Aquaman. It was one that I saw a lot at Toys R Us. I never was that impressed by it, though, and I never really felt the need to pick up his non-superhero look in the film, so I kind of just left both of those on the pegs. However, the basic Parademon does a pretty good job if you just put him in the midst of the figures, and I never really felt the need to go beyond this one. Now, the other big item that they had was a Multiverse Batmobile, and just as an addendum to the previous part, yes, there was a basic Batmobile, but it was so similar to the original basic line Batman v Superman Batmobile that I really didn't feel the need to talk about it that much at the time, so it kind of slipped my mind when I filmed it. Well, for the Multiverse line, they actually did a version of the Justice League Batmobile with a giant top-mounted cannon, and I can't remember exactly seeing it out very much at all. I'm not exactly sure what the availability on it was, and I remember that it looked really nice. It's very sought after today on the collector's market because it was a movie Batmobile in 1/12 scale, which is something that Mattel hadn't done for the Batman v Superman Batmobile. So it's still something that people try to grab for their Mezco figures and their Mafex figures and all of those. However, the big daddy of them all that Mattel released, and we'll definitely consider it a part of the Multiverse line since it includes a figure that is pretty much a reworked version of Tactical Armor Batman. That is their Ultimate RC Batmobile. This thing was huge. As a matter of fact, for some baffling reason, which might have been due to the mechanics of it being an RC item, is that it was in 1/10 scale, meaning that technically it was too large for these figures. So that was always something that was a little bothersome. I always thought it looked really nice. However, it was one of those items that was going to be so large and just so complex, and it even had smoke solution that you could put in and that would come out the back and it had a camera in it. I kind of think this is one of those push items that toy companies, I think, mistakenly shoot for the moon sometimes, and they end up releasing something that I'm not even really sure most people are in the market for. They kind of plus themselves out, and as a result, they price themselves out of the market. I believe that it was about $150 upon its release, and although it looked neat, it just seemed a little bit much for me and seemed much more like a toy than a collector's item. It was one of those things that was more of something you would order, but there is one time that I did see it at retail, and that was at Costco, which was that Christmas or the next Christmas. I think it might have been Christmas 2018 when I saw it. Somehow or another, Costco, I suppose, had made a deal with Mattel to where they ended up with probably some of the back stock of this thing because clearly Mattel probably had a hard time selling it. Now, at the time, I probably should have grabbed it, but honestly, it was just so large and so cumbersome looking. It had so many features that I would never use. I made the decision not to. Like I said, probably should have, and it probably would have looked great in my display, but I have many, many, many other versions of the Batmobile, so I just didn't feel like I could deal with that. Other than that, that does it for the Mattel Multiverse line of action figures. Now, Mattel would go on to do a few other multiverse pushes. They would do their Aquaman multiverse push and their Shazam multiverse, and of course you can count Wonder Woman in there as well. And the multiverse line that Mattel did was certainly an interesting experiment for them. I think that they were trying to bring together a couple of groups of toy collectors. I think they were still trying to appeal to that younger market, keep the price point reasonable, while trying to appeal to the adult collectors. It didn't always work for them, though. As we've seen, there were a few shortcomings of this line. At this time, this is when Mattel started to really have plenty of opposition from companies like Hasbro, who had been leaning a lot more heavily into the 6-inch scaled toy lines than they ever had before, with massive improvements to their Marvel Legends and Star Wars Black Series figures. So it was only a matter of time until Mattel let this license lapse. This line is kind of an interesting time capsule of a few different things. You can see the things that Mattel were really good at and tried really hard at. Things like trying to deliver a high-quality Build-A-Figure, and an especially large one as well, considering Steppenwolf is nearly 12 inches tall here. However, more than a time capsule of their success, it is also a time capsule of a lot of the things that they frequently failed at. One of those things was actor likenesses. Although half of these are really pretty good, the other half are far from perfect. And so it was something that they continued to struggle with, and something that I think made the lines less and less desirable. Another thing they really struggled with was the engineering of joints on figures. Whether we're talking about the horrendous ab crunch of something like the Walmart exclusive Batman, I bet Walmart felt pretty upset when they saw what they got. Or you're looking at some of the lack of ab crunch in the other figures, it's almost like they really couldn't make us happy one way or another. And I'll fully own that we complained about there not being ab crunch, then they did it, and then it didn't turn out right. So just the engineering of the figures with the way that the hips were done and the way that a lot of the knee joints looked, and especially the ankle joints, Mattel was beginning to kind of lose the adult collector's market. Guys, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the Multiverse line of 6-inch figures from Mattel. It certainly brought me back and made me think of those days when they released these figures originally. I, of course, appreciate all of your views and subscriptions, and it means the world to us for you to join up with the channel. We're growing all the time. We especially don't want you to miss out on the next 2 parts of our special look back at the 2017 marketing push for the original Justice League. Don't forget, the Snyder Cut is currently streaming on HBO Max, and after having a chance to watch it, I'm sure that you won't regret it. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you and yours, and I'll see you on Fanboys Forever. Take care.